peak oil, peak furnishings, and apparently we're entering an era of peak whiskey too. The growing popularity of whiskey is leading to booming demand for premium Scotch and Canadian whiskey that's outstripping supply in some cases, and casks. Distillers from Scotland, Japan, and Kentucky didn't lay down sufficient whiskey back in the 1980s and 90s to satisfy today's booming demand. After a drop in the 70s, whiskey sales bounced back in 2006. Today, surging demand from China, Russia, and other emerging markets has resulted in a run on premium whiskeys. That has some aficionados fearing the disappearance of older vintages from Canadian shelves forever. But Scotland's single malt losses are proving to be Canada's rye whiskey makers' gains. Late last year, influential American whiskey critic Jim Murray pronounced Crown Royal's Northern Harvest Rye the best whiskey in the world. Murray wrote in the 2016 edition of his Whiskey Bible, "Doubtless there will be many eyebrows raised because rarely is Canada mentioned when it comes to the world's top whiskeys." At an average price of $30 a bottle, Crown Royal's Northern Harvest Rye flew off the shelves. Joining us to talk about peak whiskey and what other Canadian producers are gaining attention is Mark Gillespie. He's the host and executive producer of the Whiskey Cask podcast. So, Mark, first of all, just how serious is this shortage?
The shortage is not serious at all. What we have is a shortage of aged whiskey. The distillers today are cranking out whiskey as fast as they can make it, but you really won't see it ready for 5 to 7 to 10 years at the earliest. I want to give you an analogy for what it takes to forecast this. This is the hardest commodity to forecast demand for because you have to age it. Think of a hockey general manager in the NHL that has to draft his players 21 years in advance before they're even born and figure out exactly what the state of the game is going to be, what he's going to need, how his older players are shaping up in that 21-year time period. And nobody ever gets this right. Anybody that tells you they get their whiskey forecasts accurate is delusional.
All right. Okay. Now you're saying it's not serious, but you say there is a particular type of whiskey now, and we were talking about it. It's the aged whiskey. I mean, there's got to be consumers of that who are pretty upset.
What they're upset about is, and I take a controversial view on this, a lot of us got spoiled in the 2000s, in the first part of this decade, because we benefited from the overproduction in the 1990s. We benefited from poor whiskey sales that forced Scotch whiskey producers to lower their prices, and Canadian whiskey producers as well, and whiskey producers all over the world. So we got used to buying old whiskey at cheap prices. Now, as the demand has gone up, the prices have gone up, the supplies of that old whiskey have gone down, and the prices are going up, and that's really what has people upset.
Now, you say you have a controversial view on this. What's the mainstream view of the situation?
Well, the mainstream view is that people are upset within the whiskey community, the whiskey fabric, if you want to put it that way, because they're seeing their favorite expressions that are 12, 15, 18 years old being replaced by what we call no age statement expressions that don't have an age statement on them, that are made with younger whiskeys, and they cover the same price as the 12-year-olds or some of the whiskeys they're replacing. The problem is they don't like that price increase for what they think is inferior whiskey. The difference is that those whiskeys are blended to taste, so you're actually getting whiskey that tastes just as good. You're just not getting a number on it, and the number is what everybody wanted to see.
So you're saying that it tastes just, I mean, I have to admit, I'm not a whiskey drinker.
Okay.
I can't give you my own impression of whether the old stuff is better than the unlabeled stuff, as you're describing. You're saying there isn't that much of a difference.
Well, some of the best whiskeys that are on the market and have been for years have no age statement on them. That's because the whiskey blenders and the whiskey producers are blending those casks according to taste to get the taste profile they want for their whiskeys. The advantage of not putting an age statement on there is that you can put a cask of that whiskey that is 5 to 8 years old that meets your taste profile and put that into that no age statement whiskey. But if you put a number on it, every bit of whiskey that goes into that bottle has to be that age. You can't wait 12 years and a cask can become over-oaked, it can become too woody, and you sit there waiting for this cask to mature. But if you can get it at 5 to 7 years and put it into a no-age statement whiskey, and you're getting the taste you want, then I don't see the problem with that.
So now all of this, I guess, adds up to good times for Canadian distillers. I mean, what do you see ahead for that industry in Canada?
Well, you're getting the benefit of what the rest of the world can't do. Something that Canadian whiskey distillers have the option to do is they can be more creative, because distillers in Scotland, Ireland, to a certain extent, and the U.S. are more restricted by laws on what they can do with whiskey. Canadian distillers have more options in terms of being more creative with the recipes they use, from the different grain styles they use, to being able to add flavors in some cases, and being able to create a more unique whiskey that the rest of the world can't produce, because in Scotland, for instance, a single malt can only be malted barley, yeast, and water, plus the wood and the thyme. You can't put anything else into it. But in Canada, you can create whiskeys that are tailored to individual taste profiles. And that's going to make Canadian whiskey more interesting for people going down the road.
Well, and I'm sure it didn't hurt that the Crown Royal Northern Harvest got so much attention. That must have been a good thing, don't you think?
Well, I want to correct you on one point, Diane. Mr. Murray is not an American. He is a British citizen. We do not claim him in America, and I say that jokingly, of course. But what he did was pick a very interesting whiskey that, frankly, I don't think was the best one Crown Royal released last year. But it was in very limited supply. Nobody knew it was coming, so that when Jim released his book and announced the award, there wasn't any stock of it on the shelves to be had, so people couldn't go out and buy it. But what that did do was open up the door to get them thinking about other Canadian whiskeys, and we should see some interesting sales results after the holidays with some of those pre-holiday sales. We should start to see that fairly soon.
All right. Well, thanks so much for being with us, Mark.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.